Hey guys, LC Holt here, and this is my update for April the 29th. Today, we got a show for you about Ted Bundy. There is so much we have to cover in this show, more information than you could cover in an hour, and this is only the first part of two parts, so we're going to have to get right to this. But before we get right to this, let me introduce my regular collaborators. Ryan Rayonec, how are you, man?
I'm hanging in there.
And Zach Myers, what's up, buddy?
Hey, what's up? I am also hanging in there.
And you know what? I'm also hanging in there. And you know who else was hanging in there? How's this for a segue? Louise Cowell. Louise Cowell was hanging in there. Who is Louise Cowell, you might ask? Well, she was a young woman. And on November 24th, 1946, this young woman gave birth to a beautiful baby boy named Theodore Robert Cowell. Now, she gave birth to him at a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont. She was a young woman. She had gotten up with somebody. There's a lot of controversy about who it was, and I'll go into that here in a minute. And she had, given birth to this illegitimate son. She leaves after giving birth and just drops the baby off at the home for unwed mothers and comes home. And her father, Samuel Cowell, says, "Hey, didn't you have a baby?" She was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Where is it?" She says, "I left it." He's like, "Get your ass back there and bring that baby home." So that is how Theodore Cowell wound up being raised by his grandparents, Samuel Cowell and Eleanor Cowell. Now, Theodore, he was raised the first 3 years in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And he was actually raised to believe that Samuel and Eleanor, his grandparents, were actually his parents. And that his mother, Louise, was his older sister. That evidently was not so unusual an arrangement in the 40s, because if you know anything about a little actor named Jack Nicholson, Jack Nicholson had the exact same upbringing. He was raised believing that his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. So as we go on into this story of Ted Bundy, we'll start talking about maybe some of the factors that turned him into who he became. Yeah, right.
I don't want to interrupt you, but there was a 10-second pause on my end where I couldn't hear what you were saying, and then when you came back, you were just talking about a pretty weird arrangement where I didn't have anything to go by. Did you just say he thought his mom was his sister?
Yes, he would. Yeah, Mr. Theodore Cowell was raised to believe that his mother was his sister, and that his
okay.
And that his grandparents,
weird, man. Fucking people are weird.
That his grandparents were his parents. Now, there's a lot of controversy as to when he found out this lie. And in fact, he even tells the story different ways. That's one thing we'll find out about Ted Bundy is he likes to tell stories differently depending on who he's talking to. At one point, he said that he found out when he was 14 years old, and he was looking in a chest and found his birth certificate, and it said "Father unknown, Mother Louise Cowell," and he was like, "Wait, Louise? Isn't that my sister?" And then other times he said that he found out like in 1969. So he tells the story differently, but either way, eventually he found out he was illegitimate and that the woman he thought was his sister was his mother. I tend to think maybe it was early on, because at a certain point, Louise took Ted away from the East Coast and moved over to Washington State. Now, one of the reasons that she took him across the country is because her father, Samuel Cowell, was a very abusive guy. He was physically and emotionally and sexually abusive to both of his daughters, Louise and Julia. Louise's sister Julia at one point was even thrown down the stairs by Samuel in a fit of rage. And one time, he went into a complete shit fit because someone brought up Ted's parentage. And according to family members in the Cowell family, people think that maybe Samuel raped his daughter, Louise, and that Ted's father was actually his grandfather.
Oh, Jesus.
Now, this is a family rumor, and it's not been substantiated. Louise would never own up to that. She actually said that Ted's father was a guy named Jack Worthington, who was in the U.S. Navy. There's no Jack Worthington ever been found at that time in the U.S. Navy. So she obviously made that up or changed the name, or maybe the guy told her the wrong name. Either way, she never revealed to Ted or to anyone else in her lifetime who his real father was. But certain family members tend to think that his father was actually his grandfather. So we got that, okay? Really fucked up early childhood. So it's probably good that Louise in 1950 moved in with some cousins out in Tacoma, Washington. She wound up meeting a guy named Johnny Culpepper Bundy. And she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy. And John...
Not with a name like that.
Yeah, Culpepper, buddy. You know? But that's where Theodore Cowell got his name, because John Bundy adopted him legally and changed his name from Theodore Cowell to Theodore Robert Bundy. And Louise and Mr. Culpepper Bundy, they had four other children. And Ted never really was into like the sibling thing. He was really distant. He kind of considered himself an only child. And not only that, but he didn't look fondly upon his stepfather, even though he took his name. It's not like he had much choice, but because he was too young, you know. But he kept his stepfather's name, but he did not particularly care for the guy because, as he said later in his life, he thought he was kind of lower class. He didn't make a lot of money. He wasn't very ambitious. And these are things that later Ted would pride himself as being, after going through a long period of being quite unambitious himself. But anyway, so he was raised out there in Tacoma, Washington. As a teenager, he had a few run-ins with the law that were later expunged. He would go and peep in people's windows. At one point, I think he tried to break into a car. These were all juvenile offenses, and when he turned 18, they were removed from his record. So as a young adult, when he graduated high school, he had a completely clean record, Ted Bundy did. He graduated high school in 1965, and he went to the University of Puget Sound for a short period, and then the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese. Now, before I go into that, let's... Say that again, Ryan?
That's a major now?
I guess it was a major in 1965. I don't know. But before we go into like the college thing, maybe we could discuss for a second this whole childhood thing. Because I breezed through a lot of stuff there, and there's a lot of crazy shit going on in Teddy's childhood. Thoughts, Ryan?
It's pretty fucked up. I mean, like... Every time you would mention someone else, you're like, oh, this is his sister or this is his cousin. I'd be like, allegedly, you know, if I don't know. Once you're lying about who the mom is and everything else, who's to say who's, I don't know. It's what like a conspiracy. I don't know. See, I didn't know much about Ted Bundy. I just knew the basics. You know, he killed a whole bunch of girls. You know, I didn't know about the fucked up, you know, I don't know. In my family, we just kind of told each other, like, hey, you know, this is your brother or your sister. Like, we just kind of like, you know, we're assigned positions and shit. This whole like, he definitely had a bad start as far as that goes. And wouldn't you like notice your mom's like driving cars and shit, like, or your sister's right, you know, like you're playing with Tonka trucks and she's got a car, like you wouldn't notice that, like. Yeah,
she was. Yeah, pretty young, but she wasn't that young. Zach, what are you thinking, man?
Well, For me, I mean, I'm a walking. I mean, most people had friends growing up. You know, I read about serial killers. So for me, this is really normal. I mean, like, you know, hearing I know all this already. So, but this is hilarious seeing Ryan. You know, watching your reaction, Ryan, because like you're freaking out right now, and that's probably a normal reaction. I mean, I'm a walking encyclopedia when it comes to serial killers, and Ted Bundy, out of all of them, I have more books and more movies and stuff about Mr. Bundy, and hearing all about this, you know, for the average person, you know, that is exactly what creates a serial killer, is lying to him about who his mother and sister is and stuff. And but
Well,
yeah,
there are a lot of there are a lot of factors in this that we can go back to later and talk about. But you know, when you have such a fucked up childhood, you don't know who your parents are, your grandparents are your parents, your sister's your mom. It's like, you know, and that obviously affects you. We're about to go into his college years, and in the college years, there was even more kind of crazy stuff going on that affected perhaps what came later.
Well,
But
let me just say this real fast to Ryan. Ryan, I've actually written letters to serial killers. I've actually gotten to like speak to them, and this is fairly normal for them, to have this fucked up of a childhood.
Yeah, I know a guy who had a decent childhood, has killed a whole bunch of people. He's down on Boulder Highway. I can probably set you up if you want to, you know.
yeah, well, and that's kind of why I pointed out like the Jack Nicholson thing, because Jack Nicholson had the exact same childhood as Ted Bundy, and he obviously didn't grow up to be a serial killer. So, you know, I don't. Some of these factors.
The guy I knew like kidnapped Ronald McDonald and held him for ransom and got the money. Fucking gangster shit.
That's pretty gangster. That's some thug life.
Jesus Christ. Went to jail for 25 years, but.
Well, you know, I mean, is Ronald dead, or is Ronald dead or alive?
No, Ronald lived. Other people did not.
Oh man, you could have made up whatever you wanted.
Yeah, you know, the people you meet without ever trying to, you know what I mean? Like, fuck's sake, especially here, the characters you meet here. But this guy, like, no, like, I would tell you if it was here, say, no, this is a legit story. Like, I've seen the article and everything on Google. The guy watches murder porn all day long. All day long. I'm talking because, you know, he's older now. You know, he's had a stroke, you know, so he's not, you know, what he was, but he fucking literally fucking has a knife by him at all times and watches murder porn from the time the day starts to the time the day ends. So I know this is off the topic.
Ryan took it to a whole new level.
Now, I just want to say that we're not talking about Ted Bundy here. So those of you just tuning in, we're not discussing Ted Bundy watching murder porn, because obviously
he's like, I didn't know all that much, you know. I've talked to Zach, but I don't know all that much about him, you know. So like, I didn't know he was all into this shit. So it's like, I was just telling him, you know, if you want leads, you know, on fucking.
All right, so we have that covered.
I know fucked up people.
So we got that covered. Now that Zach has a lead on the Ronald McDonald kidnapper, we'll jump back into to Ted Bundy here. So anyway, back to 1967. We're gonna traipse back to Mr. Ted Bundy. Met a woman named Stephanie Brooks. That's actually just an alias. Her real name is Diane, but I'm not gonna say what her real name is because maybe she likes to stay anonymous. So I'm gonna call her Stephanie Brooks, which is what a lot of books call her. She was working at the college where he went, the University of Washington. He got involved with her and started dating her, and they got really serious. But she eventually broke off this courtship because, as she said, this dude is too immature and he doesn't have any ambition. So Ted probably hated that because it's kind of like being compared to his stepfather, who he thought had no ambition. So he was not very happy. And it seemed like Ted just jumped into political life just to prove that he had ambition, because he volunteered for the Nelson Rockefeller presidential campaign and started working for the Republican Party up there in Washington State.
Oh God, this just got interesting.
Oh yeah, and just wait. We're only starting here. You thought the childhood was weird. We're about to get into some weird shit. He even went to the Republican National Convention as Rockefeller's appointed delegate in Florida, in Miami, Florida, in 1968. So he's getting into this now. Now the thing about this is, eventually he traveled around a little bit after this campaign went the way it went. He visited some family in Arkansas. He went to Philadelphia again. He went out to Colorado. He went for one semester to Temple University. Then he returned to Washington State, and he started dating this woman named Elizabeth Kepler. And she was from Utah. She was working at the University of Washington. He re-enrolled there as a psychology student and became an honors student. So all of a sudden, he's got this great drive, and a lot of it has to do with this relationship with Stephanie Brooks, because she told him he was a loser, and he's like, I'm going to prove to you I'm not a loser, baby. You left me. Well, let me show you something. I worked for the Rockefellers. I'm a part of the Republican National Convention, and not only that, but I'm now an honor student who is trying to get into law school. His grades still were not all that wonderful, but he could talk it up with the best of them, and he got a lot of people to write him recommendations from the Republican Party in Washington, and that's how he got into law school, even though his grades in his entry exam were like not very good at all, like really mediocre. Around this time, he started actually working for the Suicide Hotline Crisis Center there in Seattle, and the lady who sat next to him was Anne Rule, who later grew up to become a very famous crime novelist.
It's amazing.
So Anne Rule worked alongside Ted Bundy. And she said when he was working these crisis suicide hotlines, he was all over it, man. He was kind, he was empathetic. She thought he was like the nicest dude ever. She was locked up in this big house with him all night for hours. He'd walk her to her car when the night was done to make sure she got into it safely. She was like, Ted's a good dude. Okay. And Elizabeth Kepler also thought Ted was a good dude because she had a daughter, and she let Ted treat the daughter like he was the father. This was a daughter from a previous marriage. So he was like living a sort of a family life with Elizabeth, with the kid, working over there with Anne Rule. And he graduated from the University of Washington in 1972. Okay. And he got accepted into 2 different law schools. So he had his choice. Remember, Republican Party writing him letters. So these recommendations are getting him into law school, even though his grades aren't that wonderful. Now, here's the interesting part. And Ryan, I think you're going to like this part. Summer of 1973, that's a year after he graduates. He's traveling around with the Republican convention. One of his trips takes him into California, where Stephanie Brooks is living. Stephanie Brooks being the girl that rejected him, said he was a loser. Well, he rekindles his romance with Stephanie Brooks, whose real name is Diane, but I'm not going to mention that again. And they started dating, even though he's already dating Elizabeth Kepler up in Washington. She doesn't know about any of this, but he winds up dating them both secretly. And he even goes so far as to invite Stephanie Brooks up to Washington. They start talking about marriage. She's like, man, you have changed. I thought you were a loser. You had no ambition. Now look at you. You're going into law school. You got all these political connections. You're working with, Nelson Rockefeller. You were a delegate in Miami. And she goes, you're actually like marriage material. And he's like, yeah, I think that might be a good idea. And then
I told her, you better get your own fucking money. God, she sounds like a gold digger. Fuck. I just want to leap out my screen and slap her. Fuck you.
Wait, but just wait. This is the part I said that you would probably like, Ryan, because Stephanie goes back to California.
Zach always makes me laugh, man. Killing me.
Yeah, just wait. Here we go. Ready? Zach, you got control of yourself?
I'm good.
Ryan is going to like this when he hears it, because especially if he doesn't like Stephanie. So Stephanie goes back to California after one of these trips up to Washington, and she doesn't hear from Ted for a while. And she tries to call him. And remember, they're talking about marriage. They're getting serious. He's with this other girl and the daughter, but she doesn't know that. And then eventually she gets him on the phone and she says, you know, Ted, we were talking about marriage. Like, I really am in love with you now that you've turned your life around.
How convenient. Fucking bitch.
And then Ted says, and she's like, well, why haven't you been calling me and returning my calls? Well, Ted goes, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about, and hangs up on her.
Nice.
So this whole thing was a revenge scheme so that he could prove to Stephanie that I'm better than you ever thought I would be. You rejected me. Well, now you want to marry me, and I'm going to reject you. And he never spoke to her again. Now, was I right, Ryan? You liked that part, right?
I agree with him up to this point. We're on the level up to this point.
Well, it's going to start getting a little crazier here in a minute because we've come to the time when things start to get a little weird. But anyway, he goes and he starts.
They're just now getting weird? Okay.
Well, okay, fair point. Fair point. All right, I'll give you that. But look, you know, he was attending law school. Well, after the Stephanie Brooks thing, it was like, you know, I was in law school. I got her back with me. I proved myself. And for some reason, he just sort of seemed to not care about law school anymore because he stopped going after he rejected the Stephanie girl. He was like, well, okay, well, why am I going to law school now? I've already, mission accomplished. Well,
I actually know someone who's done something very similar. That's a whole other story. Keep on with the keep on with the chlorophyll.
We're gonna keep on trucking here. Here we go. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, Ted is about 27 at this point. Ted Bundy enters the basement apartment of a young woman, 18 years old, named Karen Sparks. He had been watching her through the window. He comes into her apartment. He takes a metal rod off her bed frame, beats her with it, sexually assaults her with it to the point that she has major internal injuries, and then leaves her there in bed to bleed to death, escaping out into the night. She survives, but she can't describe her attack or the attacker because she has serious mental and physical disabilities for the rest of her life. So, this is where it begins. And it continues. Because early morning hours, most of these things are going to be early morning hours or at night, because except for one instance, which I will make sure to point out, all of his attacks took place in the dark. February 1st, a very similar thing happened in Seattle. In fact, an almost identical crime, only the outcome was different. A young woman named Linda Ann Healy was sleeping in her basement in a sorority house that she shared with like 5 other girls. They're all at home. She's down in the basement sleeping. Well, somebody creeps into her basement room, beats her, but instead of leaving her to die, picks her up, dresses her, and carries her out into the night to his car, drives away with her, takes her. And she is actually, this gets a lot of publicity because she's a local radio personality. She did the weather for the skiers there in the area. So a lot of people would tune in to see if they wanted to go skiing. They'd listen to Linda Ann Healy. And so when she disappears suddenly, that gets people's attention. And then the cops start to connect this to the Karen Sparks case, which is almost identical, except of course Karen Sparks is alive and severely disabled, and Linda Healy has disappeared completely. March 12th, you're going to see a pattern starting. This starts to happen every month. Something starts to happen. So that was February 1st. This is March 12th. A girl named Donna Ann Manson from Olympia, 19 years old. She is coming back to her dorm room from a jazz concert, and she disappears. April 17th, Susan Rancourt disappeared on her way out from her advisor meeting to her dorm room. Now, there were 2 witnesses in this case who saw her coming toward her dorm. And apparently, and this is in Ellensburg, which is not far from Seattle. And she spoke with a man who had his arm in a sling. And this man had been loitering around the dormitory. And he had some books with him. And he was asking girls, because he had his broken arm, could you carry my books for me over to my car? And some of these girls rejected him, saying, well, I don't know about that. But they did see his car, and it was a light brown VW Beetle. So they started to think, well, maybe this Susan Rancourt was asked and she went with this guy. But they can't, at this point, they can't really say that for sure. But it's a very good suspect. They don't have any name, very vague description, but they do have the description of the VW Beetle. Now, May 6th, Kathleen Parks. She left her dorm in Corvallis to get some coffee with her friends, and she disappeared. June 1st, Brenda Ball disappeared after leaving a tavern near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Again, witnesses say that a man with light brown hair and a brown VW Beetle was seen talking to her in the parking lot of the tavern, and she was never seen again. June 11th, George Ann Hawkins vanishes while walking through an alleyway. Mere feet. This alleyway is very narrow. On one side is a dorm, and on the other side is a sorority house. George Ann Hawkins' boyfriend lives in the dorm. If you walk 10 feet from the dorm room, from the exterior door of the dormitory, over to the next door, you're inside the sorority house. Well, somewhere in those 10 feet, George Ann Hawkins vanishes without a trace. No evidence, not a drop of blood. No one sees anything really at the scene until later a witness comes forward and says, well, you know what? I did see a guy who had his arm in a cast, and he had a briefcase. And he asked me in that alleyway, he said, would you help me carry my briefcase to my car? And that car was a VW Beetle. So suddenly all these things start coming together, an MO. And all of these girls, keep in mind, are vanishing. They're not being treated as murders. They're being treated initially as missing persons, as kidnappings. Okay. So in the area, people start getting, because I just listed you a lot of girls, and people start getting like, hey, I'm not hitchhiking, which was a pretty common thing to do back then. And the police pressure is starting to mount for them to figure out what's going on here. Some descriptions are sent out from the witnesses who saw a man, a white guy, around the area of the disappearances. So it's so they're starting to piece some things together. Now, all of those took place at night in relatively remote areas, parking lots, alleyways, streets outside dormitories. Well, then July rolls around, and on July 14th, at a state park named Lake Sammamish, there is a huge get-together of over 40,000 people. They're out there partying, drinking, doing all these like games, celebrating what I would assume would something like having to do with the 4th of July, even though it's on the 14th. I'm not entirely sure what this get-together was about, but it was huge. And of all those 40,000 people, 2 women disappeared from the festivities. Okay. One woman was named Janice Ott. She was 23. She was a probation officer. And she vanished. Another woman, Denise Naslin, 19, was having a picnic there at the park with all these people. She walks over to the restroom to take, a little bathroom break and disappears. And this is a huge crowded area with a huge crowded parking lot.
I just want to say something real fast, just to kind of give people an idea of how many people were actually there. I know this might be hard for a lot of people to see, but do you see how many people are in this photo? This is an actual photo of the event that Ted Bundy took, these girls went missing, and that's a lot of people.
I gotta say though, I'm seeing this picture for the first time, and it looks like a sausage fest.
Well, there were some women there, I can assure you, because 5 of these women that were there in that?
Ted Bundy had some game because I just saw a bunch of fucking dudes.
These were the women that went missing right here.
It's fucking.
Okay, so you got those two young ladies.
Did they ever find, like, because I didn't know like much about the guy. Did they ever find like a lot of these bodies? Like, what was he doing with all the bodies? I mean, it's a lot of fucking bodies.
I'm about to get to that.
To come.
Yes, that's coming up here very, very soon because all these women, as Ryan pointed out, are missing, but we don't have any bodies yet. 5 women from the alleged sausage fest what actually saw a man in the parking lot approaching young girls and saying he had his arm in a sling, and he said, "I have a sailboat in my car here, and I'd like to get this sailboat out. Could you help me?" And one of the witnesses actually saw him talking to the young girl, Denise Naslund. And he was close enough to hear the guy say to Denise, "Hi, what's your name?" And she says, "Denise." And he goes, "Well, I'm Ted." And then she walks off with him. And they're talking, heading toward his car.
It was a good line.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty.
I love how so far in this chat, Ryan is so pro Ted Bundy.
I didn't know much about him, but
it makes me feel so less crazy, like, for being pro, like, because Ted Bundy's the most fascinating serial killer to me. So, like,
I wondered because I did a quick search last night, and I saw like there's a lot of books and a lot of I kind of wonder why the interest. I'm starting to at least see why it's such a story.
Well, you were talking about those bodies. Well, they found those bodies. They found a lot of these women's bodies, actually. Very near September the 8th, 2 hunters were out and they found Georgianne Hawkins' body out in the woods. 6 months later, they found the bodies of almost everyone else except for Donna Madsen, whose remains were never found. And they found them near Lake Sammamish at Taylor Mountain. So actually, the 2 girls, Naslund and Ott, they found just 4 miles from where they were last seen in the parking lot. He just took them right down the road, and he killed one, and then he was like, "You know what? I'm not done yet." So 4 hours later, he comes back, he picks up another one, and takes her out to the same spot and kills her. And all these bodies start popping up here. Now, these bodies are not complete. You need dental records. Their heads, their torsos, there's been a lot of animal predation. Ted knows that if you dump someone out in the woods in a secluded spot, the animals will take care of the evidence for you. Okay. And so that's exactly what.
For the most part.
Right. Because the heads were found, and, Ted had a thing about removing heads. So, but anyway, so they were found, right? August of that year, 1974, Bundy decides he's going to get out of there while the getting is good because he's been accepted again to another law school in Salt Lake City. So he boogies his sweet ass right on out of the Tacoma, of Seattle, Washington area. But that doesn't mean that he's going to stop his behavior. Let me tell you that right now, because September the 2nd, like, he's not there days, right? He murders a hitchhiker. Her body's never been found, never identified. The only reason we know he murdered a hitchhiker is because the day before he was executed, he said, "Oh, by the way, some of those other victims, I could tell you where they are because there are a lot you've never even heard of. In fact, there's a hitchhiker over near Salt Lake City where I lived that time. That's just one." October of that year, he kidnaps a woman named Nancy Wilcox. She's 16 over there near Salt Lake City. She drags her off into the woods. He later goes on to say, "Well, you know what? I was trying to de-escalate my behavior. I was just going to rape them and beat them up. But she was screaming a lot, so I had to strangle her, and I just happened to kill her." I don't know necessarily if I believe that. That might have been one of those Bundy fibs. But the same month, 18th on the same month, Melissa Smith, 18 years old, she goes missing after she leaves Pete's parlor. She is the daughter of the Midvale police chief. So suddenly people in that Salt Lake City area go, okay, maybe we should pay more attention to these crimes because this is the police chief's daughter. Now, keep in mind, none of this is being tied to the Washington State series because we're down in Utah now. And, so it's two different districts. On a Halloween of that year, Laura Ann Amy disappeared after leaving a cafe around midnight. He was discovered by hikers on Thanksgiving Day. Afternoon. Now, this is an interesting one because this is still in the Utah area, okay? On the afternoon of November the 8th, there was a woman named Carol DeRanche, and she was a very pretty young woman with dark hair. She drove a Camaro. She decided, I don't have anything to do this weekend, so I'm going to go down to the mall. She goes down to the mall. She's doing a little window shopping. Well, a man walks up to her. Good-looking guy, well-dressed. He says, I'm Officer Roseland, and I need to come and tell you that your car has been broken into in the parking lot, and I need you to come out here and see if anything has been taken out of your vehicle. She's like, oh, dear. So she goes out to the parking lot with Officer Roseland, and she opens her car door. She looks at her car. She's like, nothing's been broken in here. This doesn't look like it's been broken in. She opens the door, and she goes, I don't see anything missing. And he's like, well, no, just look down in there. Bend in there and see. She's like, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. Can I see your badge? So Officer Roseland pulls out his badge and says, here I am. She smells some alcohol on his breath, but she's like, well, maybe he was just taking a nip. He says, tell you what, we got the suspect down at the station. I need you to come down there, and we need to fill out a report on this. So she walks with Officer Roseland over to his brown VW Beetle, and she thinks, cops drive Beetles? But she gets it. She thinks, well, maybe this is undercover. So she climbs into the car with him.
Yeah, undercover guy in the Beetle. Fucking.
And so he's driving with him, and he's, talking to her a little bit. And then he starts to pull off into this parking lot out behind this elementary school. And she's
station, parking lot, whatever.
Yeah. And she's like, this is not the police station, nor are we going in the direction of the police station. And as soon as he stops the car, he grabs her, and he's got a handcuff, and he slaps the handcuff on her wrist, pulls out a gun. He says, I'll blow your head off. Don't stop fighting. And she keeps fighting, and he doesn't blow her head off. He's just trying to fight her to keep her to get back in the Beetle. He tries to handcuff her other hand. He winds up putting the other handcuff on the same wrist. So now she's got both handcuffs on one wrist, and she manages to get out of the car because their hands aren't secured. He chases her down, not with a gun, but with a tire iron, and starts swinging it at her head, and she's fighting him. And then she sees a car coming, and she pushes him off and runs toward that car and jumps inside and says, this guy is trying to kill me. And he gets in his VW Beetle and takes on out of there. So she survived. Now, she was the lucky one on November 8th because later that night, Deborah Kent was at a school play not far away, and she disappears. She leaves early to pick up her brother. She disappears out of the parking lot.
What the fuck? Where does he have all this time to just be killing random chicks? I don't know, man. This guy's fucked up.
And he was obviously really pissed about that whole thing going on with the girl earlier, Carol DeRanche, because he was like, listen, you got away from me? No, I'm getting one tonight. And he's so incensed by this that he just goes right up the road. And he's in this parking lot, and he's asking people, he's still got the badge on him. He's asking people, I need you to come over and identify a car. Every woman that walks up to the school fucking production, he's like, hey, you want to come over here? I'm a cop. I need you to check out this car. No one's going with him. Well, unfortunately, it seems like Deborah Kent, who was a 17-year-old girl, went with him, and she disappeared.
I think he should have stuck with the sailboat.
Yeah, he was a little desperate that night. Well, here's the thing, too. This is how they can tie it over to the Carol DeRanche thing, is because when the cops were checking the parking lot at the school theater, they found the key that went to the handcuff that was on her wrist, Carol DeRanche. So they know that the same guy was the one who was responsible for Deborah Kent's disappearance.
Weren't handcuff keys though back then like universal?
Well, this is how they tied the two together. I mean, that and the fact it was right down the road and, a few hours later. So, I mean, I think it was a pretty good, leap of logic to say that, well, maybe these two things are connected.
Right. Obviously, just small detail, but.
Now, January of 1975, January 12th, a woman named Carol Campbell disappeared, not in Utah, but in Colorado at the Wildwood Inn. She was staying there with her husband, who was a little bit older. He was a doctor, and his children. She says, I forgot a magazine I'd like to read up in my room. So she walks from the lobby over to the elevator, gets in the elevator, rides it up, and disappears in her hotel. She was 23 years old. So now we're moving over to Colorado. March 15th, also in Colorado, in Vail, a ski instructor named Julie Cunningham, 26, asked by a man on crutches to help load his ski boots into his car. And she goes and disappears. April 6th, Denise Oliverson, 25, disappeared while riding her bike near Grand Junction. Her sandals were later found near a viaduct. May 6th, Lynette Culver, lured from her junior high school. She was 12 years old.
What the fuck?
She was drowned and raped and then dumped in a river. Her body never found. The only reason they know what happened to her is because they found out later from the guy that did it. June 28th, Susan Curtis, vanished from Brigham Young University in Utah, was murdered. Many of these bodies, Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culverson, and Curtis, were never found. So they're still somewhere out there between Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. Now, while all this is happening, Ted Bundy has been living in Salt Lake City. The furthest he's traveling to do these murders is 400 miles into Colorado. But most of them are in the general vicinity of Salt Lake City. He has ingratiated himself into the local community. Part of what he's done is he's become a Mormon. He joins the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, starts attending all their activities, is baptized into the Mormon Church.
He lost me after the early part.
Say that again?
He lost me after the early part. He had me at hello and then he fucking lost me.
Well, he did indeed become a Mormon. And he sort of started dressing like a Mormon. He's got the suit and he's got the hair combed over to the side and he's looking really, but he always kind of looked really, put together.
I've been to the Greyhound station in Salt Lake City. It's fucking terrible.
Did you see? You have to be careful, man, because you might run into somebody like.
It was what's that show, The Living Dead or Walking Dead? I don't watch it, but I'm aware of it. The Walking Dead. It was 100% The Walking Dead. It was bad.
Well, what are you thinking over there, Zach? You've been mighty quiet for all this list of horrors I've been reeling off.
Yeah, like I said, I know a lot. I'm more of getting a kick out of, your reaction, Ryan, to all of this, because
just listen to this last part when he was going through, person by person by person. Like, to me, I'm just thinking like practically, like if it's to put yourself in that guy's shoes, that's a lot of fucking like problems. Why would you want so many goddamn fucking problems? Like, dumbass, and it's like, fuck. I mean, it's not just good to kill girls. But I'm just.
Hang on a second, one at a time. What were you saying, Ryan? Go finish what you were saying.
I mean, it's just like, why? Like, I don't understand. Like, what is he getting out of it? I guess. Like, what's the? I mean, all it can do, and now you got to worry about looking over your shoulder because you're killing all these people. Like, I just don't get it. Like, what is he doing? Like, I don't get the motivation. Like,
well, what do you think, Zach? What do you think his motivation was here in this?
Well, there's no motivation. There's a serial killer is a lot like a drug addict, and they need
it did kind of sound like that, like he needs it, just by the dates, like
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much every month.
He's an addict, and like the average serial killer, which Bundy was not the average serial killer. Bundy was he was way worse. I mean, he was way more compulsive. He was way more it's like taking, a hit of a drug, and that drug's not doing it for you. So you need something stronger. You need something harder. That's where Bundy was at. And Bundy, the more kills he did, the more it just didn't do it for him. Hence why he grabbed 2 girls in the same day in a crowded area. Hence why one girl got away instead of just hiding or, just calling it a night, grabbed another one. He had to get that fix, and he didn't feel
It's
right.
just a really fucking weird fix, man. That's a fucking.
It is.
Well, there was something Bundy said later, and we'll get into all his confessions and stuff on the next episode in part 2 of this. But I just want to mention this now because Ryan has sort of brought up, why he's doing this or what the compulsion is. And he said later that in order to do these crimes, he had to get good and liquored up. Now, here's the deal. Like, if you're going to go out and murder people, would the first thing you do be get liquored up and ride around your car with all the implements of murder? Do you think that that's real, or do you think he's fucking with it? Because he fucked with a lot of people and told a lot of lies later on.
It wasn't just liquor. He was smoking pot, because he later admitted that he was smoking several joints, and yeah, he was going to the bars and he was getting, but yeah, I think he needed that liquid and smoke courage in order to do some of it. But it was still an addiction. He still needed to do it.
But don't you think it's almost like an incredible amount of luck to be driving drunk around, taking dozens of girls off into the woods without it ever being detected, really, murdering them? And then
it's what I've thought for years. All the CSI shows are bullshit just to get you to fucking believe there's someone out there that's gonna be looking for someone who, if something happens to you, that they're gonna be, it's like no one gives a fucking shit.
Well, I don't want to go too far into this because it's kind of like already past and stuff. But like when Bundy was young, when he was really young, he was really into those like comic books that were like, not like Tales from the Crypt, but like shock suspension stories and those crime detective comics. And he got excited sexually by them. And because they usually depicted a woman being strangled or a woman being tied up or whatever. And then he got addicted to porn. Well, that went into a harder porn, obviously, and he had to watch women being so. As a lot of rapists or psychopaths or even just addicts, he had to progress. So it started off very harmless just by looking at comic books, which I'm not saying comic books do that. That's bullshit. But yeah. for him, that he shouldn't have been looking at. I grew up reading Shock Suspension. I grew up reading Tales from the Crypt, and I'm not a psychopath. So. But for him,
Ryan said allegedly.
Allegedly. Yeah, we need to start saying that, allegedly. But yeah, he, I mean, I guess I write serial killers. I'm not normal. But yeah, he just had a problem.
Well, I mean, here's another thing with me too, and. He said a lot of things caused this, but like you said, a lot of people read crime stories and even looked at violent, S&M type pornography and didn't do what he did. A lot of people had fucked up childhoods. Like I said before, Jack Nicholson had an exact situation, but he didn't go off and that we know of. Murder women and dump their bodies in the woods and cut their heads off. Because like Ted Bundy would do all kinds of stuff. Not only did he just murder these people, he would go back and he would have sex with their bodies. He cut off their heads and had sex with their heads. He made them up with makeup and redressed them and took pictures of himself laying with them. I mean, he would go back.
Let me just say this. One thing about Bundy is he liked control. He didn't get control in the real world. In the real world, people walked all over him. Women didn't listen to him. By doing these acts and doing the things that he did, and again, I am just a walking encyclopedia when it comes to serial killers. I'm not justifying any of it. Ted Bundy did all of this. He felt it was his way to control. He controlled people by doing this, and that was his way to be better than the average person.
And he was extremely narcissistic.
Yes.
Everybody that ever talked to him said that, like, the conversation always started with him and ended with him. You know, that was just his personality. And like I say, we'll get into that more.
He should definitely come to Vegas.
I think he would have flourished in Vegas in more ways than one. I'll put it that way.
That describes the people here like to a T. Like, he definitely belonged here.
Now, we can go on and discuss some more of this stuff, but I'll give a little teaser for next week because this is only part one of this. Because as you can tell, I rattled through that shit so fast. And you could go into all of it in greater detail. I tried to hit on the big points. But on August 6, 1975, Bundy's luck ran out because he got arrested. And if you want to know more about how he got arrested, you got to join us next week. But that's not the end of the show, because I want to ask a couple more questions about this Theodore Robert Bundy. Zach, you know a lot about this guy, right?
Yeah.
Do you buy into any of the bullshit that he says later on when he got, not just arrested this time, because you'll find out next week. I'll put it this way. There are things that happen in this story that if it was in a movie, you would go, there's no way that would ever fucking happen. And it happened more than once. And I won't go into exactly what it was. We'll talk about that next week. But I'll tell you a couple things next week and you'll be like, oh, you're bullshitting me, right? But no, it really happened. But when he was talking to these cops after said events, do you buy any of what he said? Because he said a lot of stuff. He made a lot of excuses and he blamed a lot of other people.
I believe a lot. Some of the crimes he admitted, a lot of what he said, he was a compulsive liar, and he also, and just like a lot of other serial killers, didn't see anything wrong with what he did. And he also would just lie through his fucking teeth to I mean, again, I don't want to go into too much because we'll go into it in the next chat, but he claimed he was innocent. He was just an innocent Republican that was being trapped by the system. And but I that's all bullshit. But I mean, I believe some of it.
What'd you say, Ryan?
Sounds like Trump.
Man, I don't even want to touch that. I could touch it, but I'm not going to.
It's not a negative. Just he thinks people have been lying. When
you go into like a Ted Bundy chat and then you compare Trump to him,
I'm not comparing the two.
Oh,
but
I got you. I think
just that one little segment of it. Which.
And I mean, and I want to throw out there because, when you were mentioning, this is a little Bundy fact for all the, viewers watching that might be fascinated by it. When you mentioned that when he worked at the suicide hotline and he worked next to an Ann Rule. Well, Ann Rule was like you said, was a famous crime novelist. She wrote about a lot of famous serial killers. Well, she did write a book about Ted Bundy. And for anyone who is interested, it's called The Stranger Beside Me. And it's all about her, working with Ted and a lot about his crimes and everything. And they actually even made it into a movie starring Billy Campbell as Ted Bundy. And it's a great story and stuff. But just a little Bundy fact for everyone.
And also, I want to say, now that you brought up Ann Rule, because that reminded me of something. When this late Sammamish thing happened and they got the name Ted and then they got a description and they started to link it all together, they started sending some of this stuff up to Washington State finally and linking it to the crimes in the Pacific Northwest. And when they did that, Ann Rule, even though she liked the guy, and Elizabeth Kelfler both went to the police and said, you know what? I mean, I think this might be this guy I know, Ted Bundy, because all these things were starting to go off in their heads. The VW Beetle, the name Ted, the description. You know, they were going, hang on a second. And then Elizabeth Keffler started going, you know, there was that time when he was living with me when I found those women's underwear. And then there was another time when I found a glass jar full of house keys. And I thought, wonder why he has those. And he would never explain them. And so it's not as if he was completely,
What's that picture? I can't see it.
You got to say something.
Oh, this is Mr. Bundy right here with his ex.
Yes, and that's Elizabeth, right? That's not Stephanie.
Yes, that's Elizabeth. Yes. And they're doing dishes.
Is this how Married with Children started? This picture?
This is exactly how it started.
Well, I mean, yeah, Ted, and yeah, that sort of fits, sort of, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so what I meant by saying that is even though he had charmed some of these people, a lot of them were sort of starting to go, I don't know, this sounds a lot like old Teddy Boy. Maybe we should tell the cops. And they did, but the cops, you know, were like, this guy's got no criminal record because, as I said before, all the teenage crimes were expunged. So, like, this guy's in law school. He's a clean-cut dude. We're expecting a criminal record in here somewhere for somebody who's making all these women disappear. So the cops dismissed him. Now, you have to keep in mind, they had like 200 tips coming in, you know, so they had a lot of people to go through and many, many suspects. But they dismissed all these Ted Bundy tips based on his appearance and his background and the fact he had no criminal record that they knew of. So, you know, if you really think about it, maybe you could have had him earlier. What do you think?
It's totally possible. You know, he used that to his advantage. I mean, he did when he was younger too, and he, you know, he was he always, you know, he was an all-American boy. You know, he even had a paper route, as he claimed. And
he told a lot of bullshit too later on because he made it sound like he had a real like, Eddie Haskell childhood. He was like, oh, yeah, everyone was happy. I had a bunch of friends and I was popular in high school. And come to find out, like, none of this was true. But in his mind, he had created this world where he was this perfect guy who had a perfect childhood and a perfect set of parents. And we all know that wasn't true.
And the one thing that was true, which do you want me to go into at all what he did as a kid? Crime-wise, or do you want me to talk about the next chat?
Maybe we should save that for the next chat because we've just about run out of time. But I know what you're referring to, and we might start off the next chat before I tell you how he got arrested in 1975 with that little tidbit, which is interesting. It is interesting. So, Ryan, do you feel like you've learned any more about Ted Bundy?
Oh, yeah. I knew basically no. I knew very little. I knew, you know, he killed girls, and that was the extent of that I knew about it.
So are you primed up?
Which I have a problem with because this is how Sausage Fest happened.
Do you have, okay? Do you have? Are you primed up for the next part?
Sure. It's interesting, but I just don't get the motivate. I'm money motivated, so it's like I think about all these bodies like this is just gonna cost me money, and you know, like I'm thinking from my perspective, like I don't like this guy anymore. He's fucking, you know, went from being ambitious to now you just cost me money, Ted. Can't be your friend.
Cost me money, Ted.
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, when you talk about motive too, it baffles me because you look at some of the things.
Well, if you kill the girl, I mean, like if you like, okay, you like a chick at least enough to have sex with a dead body. If you fucking kill her, I mean, like, I don't get it. Like, to have sex again, they usually have to be alive. So the whole killing of the female was something I never fucking even thought of. You know, like it just kills the next chapter. You know, for me anyway. But I guess. Yeah, fucking some people think a little bit differently. Fuck's sake.
Yeah, Ted is on a plane all his own, but we'll go into more of that next time. But I want to thank you guys for joining me this week. I hope you at home enjoyed it. And Ryan, thanks for joining me, buddy.
No problem.
And Zach, thank you, my man.
No problem. Anytime.
And next week, we will continue our Ted Bundy discussion. Until then, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves.
Allegedly.